In 1780, the Royal Navy bought more than 500 examples of a brand new weapon. It paid £13 apiece, serious money in a service that accounted for every nail. It wrote the gun into its own distribution tables. 20 for every first-rate ship of the line, 16 for a second-rate, 12 for a third, 10 for every frigate, and then, for the next 24 years, its officers quietly declined to hand them out, not because the guns were scarce, not because anyone had misplaced them, because of what happened when a man pulled the trigger. 12 pounds of iron and walnut, 36.5 inches from butt to muzzle, shorter than a standard infantry musket, and far worse balanced because almost all of that weight sits forward in a single block of steel. 7 muzzles, 1 trigger, every barrel firing in the same instant. It looks like something built to frighten people. It wasn't. It was an answer to a problem so specific that once you understand the problem, the gun stops looking absurd and starts looking almost inevitable. So here's the problem. A sea fight in the 1780s had 2 halves, and they needed 2 completely different weapons. The first half was artillery, 2 wooden hulls a few hundred yards apart trading iron and splinters. That was a gunner's war decided by rate of fire and seamanship. The second half was something else entirely. After the opening broadsides, ships were expected to close. They ran alongside, grappled, and locked together. And in that moment, a warship stopped being a gun platform and became a crowded wooden street. Crews could run to over 800 men. Sailors fell back on muskets and pistols, and it usually ended at extremely short range, pikes and cutlasses, hand to hand, 15 to 30 feet. That's the range that decided who owned the ship. And on that street, the standard firearm was close to worthless. A musket gives you 1 ball, then 15 to 20 seconds of standing still with a ramrod down the barrel while men with axe come over the rail. Pistols were common, but effectively disposable. Nobody was reloading one mid-fight. They got dropped or swung as a club. The Navy had leaned for years on blunderbusses and musketoons, which gave you spread, but not density. 1 trigger pull, a handful of shot, and then you were holding a stick again. What the Navy needed wasn't a better musket. It was volume, delivered in a single instant into a mass of men, at the exact second they came over the rail. The service already had a partial answer, and it's the part of this story almost nobody tells. Volley guns already existed at sea. They were bolted to the ship's rail on swivel mounts. Multiple barrels, 1 discharge, 1 sheet of lead sweeping the boarding line. The trouble was that reloading the chambers mid-engagement was slow and clumsy. And the deeper problem was mobility. A mounted gun can be aimed and fired from exactly one place and nowhere else. A boarding action doesn't happen in one place. It happens wherever the enemy decides to come over the side. So the brief nobody ever wrote down was this: take that single annihilating volley off the rail and put it on a man's shoulder. Give 1 sailor the first-second firepower of 7 and let him carry it anywhere on the ship. In 1779, an English inventor named James Wilson brought the Board of Ordnance a design that did exactly that. 7 steel barrels, 6 arranged around a central 7th of the same diameter, all of them firing simultaneously from a single spark. No mount, no carriage, a shoulder stock, and a trigger. He presented it in July. It went to Woolwich Arsenal for testing, and this is where the story takes the turn that decided everything that followed. Wilson had designed it as a land service arm, something for infantry. The board watched the demonstration and declared it impractical for foot soldiers, rejected in 1 sitting. But somebody in that room had a second thought. They suggested it would make a perfect weapon for sweeping a deck from above, fired down from aloft on a ship. And the Royal Navy liked the idea. The Army had examined this weapon in a field. Flat ground, no motion, a man standing still with all the room in the world. It said no. The Navy said yes, and then specified where it would be used, not on the deck. In the fighting tops at the head of the mast, issued to Royal Marines and to the sailors stationed up there, 60 feet in the air, on a platform the width of a table, on a mast that never stops moving, above a machine built almost entirely out of canvas, tarred rope, dry timber, and gunpowder. Every problem this gun would eventually have was already sitting inside that decision. It just needed one man, one flint, and 7 charges of powder to prove it. Pick the gun up and count again. 7 barrels. Now look at the lock. 1 flint, 1 frizzen, 1 pan, 1 touch hole. 6 of those 7 barrels have no connection to the ignition system at all. They have to find out about the shot some other way. Here's how. 6 barrels sit around a central 7th, all of the same bore, 0.46 of an inch, smooth bore, 20 inches long. They're brazed together into one solid cluster and screwed down onto an iron plate set into a walnut stock. Lacquered walnut, brass furniture, brass butt plate. Take the lock out and the whole barrel section unscrews from the breech unit as a single piece. The central barrel has a vent running to it. From the lock, that part is an ordinary flintlock. The other 6 barrels have vents drilled through their walls, inward into the central bore. So the flint strikes, the pan flashes, fire goes through the touch hole into the central chamber, and from that central chamber it distributes into the 6 outer ones. The flame from the middle charge doesn't only travel forward, it travels sideways, through 6 drilled channels into 6 waiting charges of powder, which means this gun has no mechanism for firing 7 barrels at once. It has holes. That is the entire engineering achievement, and it's smarter than it sounds. No second lock, no selector, no linkage, no cam, no additional moving part, nothing extra to seize, snap, or corrode. In 1779, every mechanical component was hand-filed and hand-fitted, and every one of them was a future failure in salt air. Wilson's design added exactly none of them. The powder does the work, and you can still see how it was built. Those vents had to be drilled after the barrels were already brazed into position, because there was no other way to reach that geometry. So the drill came in from the outside, and every entry hole had to be plugged afterwards. Surviving guns still carry the sealed drill holes on the outer faces of their barrels, a ring of small scars. The object still shows you the order in which it was made. There was one other version, and it barely survived contact with reality. The very first order was for 2 7-barreled rifle guns, rifled bores for accuracy. They were tested, and they were too slow to load. Every barrel after that was smooth, which makes sense the moment you think with your hands instead of your eyes. Rifling grips the ball. A tight ball needs force and time to ram home. Now do that 7 times on a platform that won't hold still, in a fight measured in seconds. Accuracy was the first thing this design traded away, and it traded it away before a single gun reached a ship. 1 spark, 7 charges, and nothing in between but drilled holes and trust, which is roughly how a channel like this one works too. 1 video, 1 share, and it turns up in front of people who are never looking for it. So if you want the rest of this, the sea trials, the broken bones, and the reason the Admiralty eventually behaved as though these guns had never existed, subscribe, and the series will come to you. Back to the workshop. Because there's a name problem here. James Wilson designed this gun. Nobody calls it a Wilson. In 1780, the Crown commissioned a London gunmaker to build 2 prototypes from Wilson's drawings. The Admiralty liked them enough to place a full production order with his firm, and that single contract is why every mention of the weapon since has called it a Nock. Henry Nock supplied the Board of Ordnance from 1773 until 1806. He was better known for expensive dueling pistols and fine sporting guns. He did not invent the volley gun that carries his name to this day. He simply became its only supplier. Then the board specified the load, and this is the number the rest of the story runs on. 2.5 drams of fine rifle powder per barrel, roughly 68 grains each, about 476 grains in total. 476 grains of powder igniting in the same instant, in a gun held against one man's shoulder. And there was a deeper unease that the inventors of the period already understood. The flintlock itself was a poor fit for multiple simultaneous discharges, especially on a swaying, chaotic ship's deck. Everybody involved knew the ignition system was being asked to do something it had never been designed for. They built 500 anyway. In May 1780, the Board of Ordnance and the Admiralty awarded Wilson £400, somewhere around 48,000 in today's money, and he played no further role in the testing or development of the gun. The man who understood the design better than anyone alive took the money and walked away from it before a single one had been carried into a fight. On paper, it was finished. On paper, it was the most concentrated firepower any man on earth could carry on his shoulder. The arithmetic was correct. The metallurgy was correct. The ignition worked exactly as drawn. There was one variable that never made it onto the drawings. Start with the body, because that's where this weapon was actually tested. A shoulder joint is a shallow ball sitting in a shallow socket, held there by muscle and by one thin strap of bone running from the shoulder to the breastbone, the collarbone. It's among the most frequently broken bones in the human body, and its job is to hold your shoulder away from your chest. It was not designed to absorb the recoil of 7 simultaneous powder charges. The guns arrived slightly too late for the American War of Independence. The first reported use came with Admiral Howe's fleet at Gibraltar in 1782. That September, the Admiralty sent Admiral Richard Howe to escort a convoy in to relieve the besieged garrison there, and among the weapons distributed across his ships were the 7-barreled volley guns, 20 to each line of battle ship in the convoy, a dozen to each frigate. The distribution table stopped being a table. Several hundred of these things went to sea, in the middle of one of the most desperate logistics operations of the war. And then the reports start coming back, not as a single verdict, but as a queue of separate failures, each one arriving from a different direction. The first was the recoil and the fix that broke something else. All 7 barrels fired almost together, and the recoil was severe enough to earn the gun a reputation for dislocating shoulders. Its weight did almost nothing to soak that up, so the service charge was cut to 1.5 drams of ordinary musket powder, a little over half of what the board had originally specified, and coarser. Even after the reduction, the discharge could still leave a man with a dislocated shoulder or a fractured collarbone. Large, hardened sailors avoided firing it. Then look at what that correction did downstream. On at least one surviving gun, the steel ramrod has an extension brazed onto the end of it, most likely because the rod sized for the original charge no longer reached properly once the lighter load came in. Follow that chain. Reducing the powder moved the seat of the ball. Moving the ball made the ramrod the wrong length. Somebody in a naval workshop had to weld an extension onto a tool to compensate for a fix that was itself compensating for a flaw. The object carries the scar of its own repair. The second failure was the elegant part. Those drilled channels, the reason the gun needed no mechanism at all, turned out to be the reason it couldn't be trusted. It had a tendency to fire only some of its barrels, leaving certain chambers empty and others still loaded with powder and ball, which meant a man reloading afterwards would charge a barrel he believed was empty when it wasn't. Double charged, sealed. 7 barrels fixed into one solid cluster, one of them now holding 2 loads, and no way to tell which one. There's a suggestion that weak lock springs made the misfires worse. The design's greatest virtue and its most dangerous defect were the same 6 holes. The third failure was the ship itself. Fired from the tops, the 7 muzzles threw out a wide bloom of flame and burning powder, directly into rigging and sailcloth a few feet away. There was real fear that the wads could set the sails and rigging alight. This is the sentence that explains everything. Officers weren't refusing a weapon that shot badly. They were refusing a weapon that could burn down their own ship in the middle of a boarding action. On a vessel of tarred hemp, dry canvas, and open powder, that isn't caution. That's arithmetic. The fourth failure was doctrine, and it had already begun without anybody's help. Naval officers disliked the guns, and Nelson was among them. Nelson disliked stationing marksmen in the tops at all. The weapon had been designed for a firing position that senior commanders were abandoning on principle. Meanwhile, down on the deck, the fight was being decided the way it always had been. Close quarters work aboard ship ran on edged weapons, cutlasses, boarding axes, pikes, and once the volley was spent, the gun became a short, badly balanced 12-pound club. 7 barrels bought you 1 instant. Everything after that instant, you were losing. The 5th failure, nobody in 1782 bothered to write down. We know about it because a modern researcher loaded an original and fired it. The butt drove hard into his right shoulder. The barrel cluster came up and struck him in the chin. And of 7 balls aimed at a target 15 feet away, 2 hit. 15 feet. That is boarding range. That is the exact distance this entire weapon existed to dominate. 5 of the 7 balls went somewhere else. There was no inquiry, no recall, no scandal. The guns simply stopped being used aboard ship, and very few accounts of their service survive. They were removed from Royal Navy service in 1804, and by 1805 the Board of Ordnance had written them off as obsolete, on the grounds that they were more dangerous to the man holding one than to anybody standing in front of him. And then one last thing happened, and it's the part of this story I find hardest to shake. In 1805, James Wilson, by then a captain of Marines, proposed that the Navy issue the guns to the Sea Fencibles, the militia defending the British coast. Nobody acted on it. 26 years after Woolwich, the man who drew the thing came back for it. He still believed. The answer was no. So the guns went into store. And here's the strange part. The record of what this weapon did to the men carrying it is detailed, physical, and specific. The record of what it did in service is almost blank. And the closer you look, the worse it gets, because we cannot even agree on how many were built. The Navy was finished with it. The design wasn't. And what's left to work from isn't paperwork. It's objects. There are 2 military patterns, and you tell them apart by the lock. The early one is a back-action lock mounted high on the stock, with the front of the lock plate running level with the side of the barrel cluster. A plate 5.5 inches by 1. Flat beveled surfaces on the gooseneck cock. The frizzen spring set vertically. The later pattern uses a smaller lock, sitting noticeably lower on the gun. The first model also carries a Queen Anne period frizzen spring the second model doesn't have, and the batch delivered in 1788 came with a double-throated cock and a conventional spring instead. Then there are the stamps, which are the closest thing this weapon has to a birth certificate. Tower with a crown and the royal cipher on the lock plate. A lock viewer's mark under the flash pan. Uch, Nock on the barrel cluster. The ordnance broad arrow behind the pan, and on every one of the 7 barrels a crown over cross scepters, Birmingham proof marks, 7 proof marks. Somebody in Birmingham pressure tested each of those barrels individually, one at a time, and punched it. Whatever else went wrong with this weapon, Nobody was careless in making it. In 1967, a collector named Clay Bedford published a study of Nock's volley guns and counted 6 distinct variants from the firm, of which only the first 2 were ever built for ordnance approval and military service. Now the part that should be simple, and isn't. How many were made? The standard modern reference gives 500 purchased, a further 100 ordered in 1787, and roughly 655 produced in total between 1780 and 1788. The ordnance receipts cited by arms dealers say 526 were received in 1780 alone, with more supplied after that first batch. Another account puts 608 made by 1787 across at least 2 series. A fourth says the follow-up order was 106 guns delivered in 1788. 4 numbers, 1 weapon, issued across every rate of ship in the most heavily administered navy on Earth, and we cannot agree on how many of them existed. Hold on to that. It comes back at the end of this story. Because here's what happened to the design once the Navy let go of it. The 7-barrel guns went on sale to private buyers. Ornate sporting pieces with wooden forends, engraving rifled bores and rear leaf sights, checkering on the wrist, wooden ramrods, elongated trigger guards. 4 known civilian variants, and a handful of them rifled, exactly as Wilson's first prototypes had been. Look at what that tells you. The rifling that was hopeless at sea is perfectly fine on land, because a gentleman shooting game has all the time in the world to load. The recoil that fractured collarbones aloft is survivable when you're standing on solid ground, firing once, at a moment you chose yourself. The engineering was never the failure. The deployment was. Take the same object off a swaying mast and it works. And the man whose name it carried was, in those same years, doing the best work of his life. In 1775, Nock patented a concealed lock, the foundation of what became his screwless design, and alongside it, his own version of the hooked breech. Barrels held by hooked studs locking into a fixed breech piece, so that pulling a few pins let you lift the barrel out at an angle instead of unscrewing a breech pin through the tang. That principle became standard on muzzle-loading shotguns for the rest of the 19th century. In 1787, he took out a further patent for an improved breech. 2 years later, he was appointed one of the gunsmiths to George III, largely on the strength of that breech design. In 1802, he became master of the gunmakers' company. His dueling pistols and double-barreled shotguns were sought after, and it's largely through Nock that the double barrel became the hunter's weapon of choice, which makes what happened next almost cruel. One of the last contracts the Board of Ordnance ever gave Henry Nock was to strip his own screwless locks out of the Duke of Richmond pattern muskets held in store and replace them with conventional ones. War and standardization mattered more than the superiority of his design. He was paid to remove his best idea from service. Same lesson as the volley gun, delivered through a different mechanism. And then, 39 years after Woolwich, the architecture came back. In 1818, Nock's workshop built a carbine designed by Artemus Wheeler, an American with a fondness for revolving guns. From the outside, it looks like the volley gun's descendant. It isn't one. It's a manually rotated, self-priming flintlock pepper box, 6 barrels around a central axis, turned by hand, fired one at a time. Unlike the volley gun, the Admiralty never tested it and never bought it. The cluster of barrels survived. All at once did not. Nock himself died in December 1804, the same year the Navy struck his guns off the books. His son-in-law, James Wilkinson, had trained in his workshops, and the business he left behind eventually became Wilkinson Sword, a firm that made officers' swords for the British Army until 2005, and razor blades long after that. By the 1820s, the volley gun should have been a footnote in a specialist catalog. Instead, one specific surviving example was about to pick up a second set of markings, punched into it by people who had never heard of the Board of Ordnance. The most famous seven-barreled gun in history is famous entirely for things it never did. In 1960, John Wayne released the Alamo. Richard Widmark played Jim Bowie, and the producers put into his hands a weapon they believed looked so powerful that only a man of Bowie's build could carry it, a Nock volley gun. He's rarely on screen without it. Even as Bowie dies, he gets off one final volley before being overrun. None of it happened. There are no historical references to any such gun at the actual 1836 battle, let alone in Bowie's hands. It takes real suspension of disbelief to accept that a British Sea Service failure traveled 2,500 miles inland to San Antonio. And here's the detail that shows exactly how the myth was assembled. Almost every mention of this weapon in the history books emphasizes its fearful discharge. On camera, Widmark pulls the trigger and barely flinches, which is easy when you're firing blanks. 50 seconds of film reversed 180 years of reputation. The gun that broke collarbones became the gun a hero handles casually, one-handed, in the middle of a conversation. Now, the object. The volley gun on permanent display at the National Firearms Museum is the very piece Widmark carried. Alongside its 18th century British proof marks and its Ordnance Board cartouche, it's stamped S595, an accession number from the Stembridge Prop House, where it sat before being auctioned to the collector Robert Peterson, who donated it. Look closely at the steel, and you can still see abrasions left by the brass barrel band the film crew fitted over the muzzle. Two provenances on one artifact. Tower proofs and a prop number, ordnance inspection and set dressing. The same piece of iron served the Royal Navy and the studio system, and the studio treated it rougher. But the reason you can search this gun today isn't Hollywood. It's a novelist. Bernard Cornwell gave one to Patrick Harpur in Sharpe's Gold in 1983. He described it as a squat menace, and he got the details right, naming the maker, the barrel length, and the weapon's brief career in the Royal Navy. When the BBC adapted the novels, Darragh O'Malley carried a Nock through the series as Harpur. That's where the cult status actually comes from. Not a battle. A paperback that bothered to be accurate about a gun the Navy had hidden in a storeroom. So the last question is the one that matters. Was the idea wrong, or just early? Nock's own workshop appeared to answer that in 1818, when it built a 6-barrel carbine that fired one shot at a time. Everything at once was a dead end. Except it wasn't a dead end. It was waiting for something. Strip away the wood and the flint and ask what this weapon was actually trying to do. Deliver a large number of projectiles in a single instant from a fixed set of barrels with no mechanical feed. In 1779, that ran into an unfixable wall. One ignition source, fire propagating sideways through drilled holes. No possible control over which barrel fired, or when, or whether it fired at all. Now replace the flint with an electrical impulse. Metalstorm's technology stacks multiple projectiles with their propellant charges nose to tail inside a single barrel, and triggers each one electrically. With no moving parts, it delivers enormous rates of fire, high mechanical reliability, low weight, and a compact package. With no ammunition feed mechanism, the systems suit light robotic ground and air platforms. And the electronic firing control lets the operator select any barrel in the cluster and set the rate within each one, from single rounds all the way up to the equivalent of a volley gun discharge. Everything at once. That phrase is in the technical description. 220 years later, the top setting is still James Wilson's idea. Mike O'Dwyer founded the company in Brisbane in the early 1990s. A 36-barrel prototype fired 180 rounds in under 1/100th of a second. It drew serious military interest, including demonstration contracts with the United States Department of Defense. And then it ran into two familiar problems. Reloading barrels packed nose to tail is slow, brutally slow, and accuracy degrades. After the company was liquidated, Its patents and prototypes passed to another Australian defense firm in August 2015, and as of 2025, nothing has been developed or commercialized on the technology. The field moved toward reliability instead of theoretical maximums, reloading and accuracy, the same two columns that emptied the Nock gun's ledger. The argument this object started has never actually been settled. Nobody has answered whether a single instantaneous mass of fire is worth what it costs the platform and the person holding it. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, objects that were right about the problem and wrong about the century, that's what this channel does. Subscribe, and the next one will find you. Because this one ends with a gap, not a conclusion. Surviving examples sit in the Royal Armouries, in York Castle Museum, in the Charleston Museum, and in the case holding Widmarks. And the best scholarly source on the weapon is over 50 years old. Relatively little is known about its service history at all. It is a gun that would benefit enormously from proper modern research. Consider what that actually means. 4 different figures for how many were built. A first deployment recorded in a single line. Almost no account of what happened when one of them was fired at an enemy. We know precisely what this weapon did to the men who carried it. The bruising, the bone, the flame, the 2 hits out of 7. We know almost nothing about what it ever did to anyone it was pointed at. 500 guns, 24 years in the inventory. And the only reliable record it left behind is the damage it did to its own side.